Hello, this is the Fiction Nonfiction podcast from Literary Hub, where we believe that every issue in your Twitter feed or on the evening news has already been tackled somewhere in literature. I'm V.V. Ganeshananthan, also known as Sugi, author of the novel Love Marriage.
And I'm Whitney Terrell, author of the novel The Good Lieutenant.
And you have said that to me 100 times.
Yes, that is right. This is our 100th episode. Happy birthday to us. I can't believe that you and I have been doing this since the fall of 2017. When we taped our first episode, you were in Berlin.
That seems an unbelievably long time ago. I just remember navigating all those time zones, being on wildly different schedules and trying to talk to you. And back then, Trump had been in office for 10 months, and we aired our first episode with Britt Bennett and Matt Gallagher about Colin Kaepernick and the politics of kneeling. And Trump's not really in the rearview mirror yet, at least not far enough for me. He probably never will be far enough in the rearview mirror for me. But we still have some things to celebrate. So what kind of party are we throwing for our 100th?
Okay, well, I got some water guns. I went down to the dime store in Brookside and got some water balloons.
Bouncy house.
I usually get like something that makes a fart noise, different kinds of whoopee cushions, anything you want. Those are at the Brookside Toy and Science, where I've been shopping for toys ever since I was 7. And you can get a lot of model rockets there. Cool. Have you ever had a model rocket?
I have not had a model rocket. I'm starting to get the feeling we had very different childhoods.
They are the best thing ever. And they go really high and they have a parachute and it comes out. It's like a firecracker, except for controlled. Anyway, I thought that for our 100th birthday or anniversary or whatever you want to call it, it would be great to talk about the major themes the Fiction Nonfiction podcast has covered over those first 4 years and give out some awards, just to give everyone a teaser. And we will talk to a great guest, Jabari Asim, in the second half of the show. But first, I want to open up just a little space to talk with you. This was a big experiment for both of us when we started thinking about creating this show back in 2017. And, we're going to talk about the topics that are important to us and thus to the show over the past 100 episodes. But one thing we don't talk a lot about on the show is our working relationship, which right now, correct me if I'm wrong, is pretty good. But it hasn't always been that way. There were things we argued about, things that we had to learn to do together. So what surprised you most about having to work with some random guy from Kansas City? We'll accept good and bad answers. Oh no, my email, I forgot to turn it off.
Oh no, did your email sting?
I just had it. All these time, it's been a long time since we've done that. All right, that's good.
I didn't hear it for what it's worth.
It's on my end. Probably didn't come through.
Well, I mean, maybe, I don't know if I'm allowed to work this into my answer, but I think one thing I learned from was your understanding of the podcast format. I think when we started the show, I listened to podcasts, but you really listened to podcasts and you had a lot of opinions about which ones you thought were good. And you were also very relentless and are relentless, I think, about the time. You were like, we will come out every 2 goddamn weeks. We will. And we really have. I went back to figure out, it was sort of on me to figure out which episode was the 100th. And when I went back to look at our little roster of episodes, there were maybe 1 or 2 times in 4 years where we had taken a break. That's like very few breaks. I mean, that's fewer breaks than certainly our academic jobs. And you promised me that there would be kind of a payoff to that, and that the regularity of that was important, both for us to like develop the content and a process and to develop an audience. And I think you were right about that. But yeah, for sure. Like when I first was like, yeah, I'll do a podcast with you. And I met you at a funeral for our teacher who we both loved. A lot of people were like, Sugi, that's quite the podcast origin story. It is a very strange podcast origin story. And, I have a lot of faith in my own gambling instincts, I think. And I was right.
Okay, so that's really interesting when you say gambling instincts, because the thing that I wrote down, and when I prep for these episodes, I have a notebook. I don't think I've ever shown you this because we never do it in the same place, but this is like it says podcast 2021 on it, and I have one of these for each year, and I make notes for the episodes in them. I do everything in a notebook, and I have like notebooks for all my classes, all my creative writing stuff, whatever. But I wrote down, trust my gut. That was the thing that I learned, was like, I just felt like, I don't know why I thought that you would be a good partner. Well, there are some reasons that I think about them. Like we had the same we had gone to Iowa. We had similar friends, even though we didn't know each other, and we'd had James McPherson as a teacher in common. And so that's like kind of like references that perhaps we would get along together and view things at least similarly. But also just something instinctually, just like you said, made me think like this would be, the chemistry here would be good. And that's extremely important. And it totally was true. And I don't know, that means maybe it's Malcolm Gladwell's whole Blink thing. Like, I always kind of think Malcolm Gladwell's slightly full of it, but maybe that's it. There's a lot of unconscious decision-making that's going on when you're trying to decide if you can work with someone. And for me, all of those things immediately fell into place. I don't really know why.
And I think you also have, the other thing was that it was a really good idea for a podcast, which sort of suggested to me that you would continue to have a lot of really good ideas, which has also been true. You're good at coming up with distinctive angles and stuff for the show, and sort of returning to that kind of journalistic way of thinking on a regular basis was really rewarding. And trusting my gut has not always been my strong suit, but I think also trusting my gut and also doing things as opposed to not doing things. I wanted to say yes. And so like sometimes I'm looking for reasons to say no. And the fact that I was looking for reasons to say yes also sort of suggested to me that it would be a product I would enjoy. I think I totally underestimated the amount of work that it was, which is, but when have I not underestimated the amount of work something would be? And I think I also didn't really anticipate all of the ways in which it would be rewarding.
It is rewarding. And, these are things, but I would say one of the most rewarding things has been finding another friend that I could have in the literary world. And our friendship has become over 4 years really important to me. When we have arguments, I think we both get really upset as if a friend was angry with us, and we don't want them to be. And so, that one of the reasons that thing I love about writing is meeting other writer friends. And this has allowed me to develop a friendship later in life. I'm in 53, that everyone comments on it's harder to make friends when you get older. And so this friendship to me has been super great. And in a way, it's now more important than older literary friendships I have with people whom I don't get to talk to I don't have a reason to talk to every 2 weeks or to work with on something. And so I have to compliment you on a bunch of things that I enjoy about working with you. You're very responsible. It is hard to be responsible. There's no way to do this podcast without trusting that if someone's going to do something, they're going to do it. And if they don't, there's going to be a good reason why they didn't do it. You have to feel like there's an equal division of labor. And I have a weakness of getting pissed off if I think somebody's not holding up their end of the bargain. And when we've argued, it's sometimes been about that, and I've been wrong every single time. So when I think Sugi's not doing this, and then you'll be like, I am doing this, you should do this, and those are the kinds of arguments that we would have. So when we had arguments, right? And every time it was because I didn't trust that you were doing the work, and you always have done the work. And a lot of times I was maybe late with something, so I appreciate that. And I feel like I can totally rely on you, which in my adult working life is not always the case. I think all of us recognize that there are not as many people that you can rely on as you think are going to be reliable in your life. And I feel like you're really fair-minded and that you have a clear moral compass. And the best thing that I feel like you've suggested for the podcast is you've said, we're going to talk about diversity in our guests later on, but you said I don't want to always ask people to talk about something that they're expected to talk about, because you felt like, well, I always get asked to review the book by this South Asian writer, but I know about a lot of other things. I know about journalism. I could, that sort of stuff. And so that way of thinking about our guests, thinking about their identity, but also not always asking them to do things that are in correlation with what their identity is supposed to be publicly, right? Was really smart, useful idea for the podcast. So anyway, those are the things that I remember. Do you remember us having arguments though? I remember getting upset with each other and worrying about it. You're rolling your eyes like you don't remember.
No, I'm not rolling my eyes. I'm trying
to block it out like I do.
I think I don't remember some of those actually. I mean, I don't remember ones where, I guess I don't really remember ones where we thought the other person wasn't doing enough work.
I think the one I can't recall specific things. The one I could recall is like, there was a time when you were like, I really don't want to do this on the weekends for various personal reasons that you were explaining to me. And I was like, but when else are we going to do it? And we couldn't figure it. And we had sort of like we had to wrestle that down to a place that we felt was fair for both of us.
Yeah. And it was like, I mean, a lot of it was like people's expectations and understanding of time, like when I was in Berlin. And when we had started doing the show, we did it all the time on weekdays. I remember early on, we didn't plan that much in advance. And we still probably plan less.
Well, that was the other thing that would drive you crazy. And I'm not that good at planning in advance. So that is something that I've learned from you. Like, okay, we need to book these guests ahead of time, like way ahead of time, instead of like the Monday that we're coming in to do the show, which was what I was doing. And you were always like, no, this is making me anxious.
Yeah, I was always worried that we were going to have a show that was going to be like, hey, here we are.
That's this show.
Yeah, that's the show. And I think we've also been really lucky. You've introduced me to a lot of great writers, like some of whom were your friends and some of whom were just, a result of your like pretty excellent taste. Like I don't think I had read some of David Means's work before he was on the show, but you were like, I want to have David Means on the show. I love his work. I don't know him. I'm just going to write him. And I was like, that's great. So I also appreciated that. I feel like it's expanded my vocabulary of, I think I've talked about this a couple of times before. Like it really has helped the way that I think about teaching. I have like a greater mental library of references. And I think also sometimes, right, when we personally know someone, we do know that they can talk about something that they aren't frequently asked to talk about. So then we get to have them on to talk about that. And so meeting people who are old friends of yours, or people whose work you wanted to highlight on the show has, I think, been really educational for me. And I think that, again, like coming up with the fun ideas, and also like sort of like I guess some of the other, like you always wanted, you don't want to plan that much in advance, but you also want to do a lot of prep, which is like a really weird combination. So yeah. I like don't want to do a lot of prep. Like you wanted to write, like we write, for listeners who might not know this, when we have someone on, we write our scripts in advance, and Whitney has like a whole way that like he thinks about the arc of the questions, and he taught me how to do this, and that was also super helpful. And at first I was like, can't we just talk to the guests? And it's true that if you do that, it turns into like, I don't know,
mush.
Yeah, it turns into mush. And so I think I both started to appreciate like the value of writing the script. And I was also like, please don't make me do this at the last minute. It'll really stress me out. So balancing those things, I think, has been helpful. Writing the scripts has been really educational. And you also, like, I think I often kind of like want to get lost in the writerly weeds. And you're like, we also need perhaps to revisit the basics of this topic for our listeners who might not know. And so your insistence on including those framing questions at the beginning, I think has built strong foundations for our conversations to be accessible while still being intelligent. I hope anyway. And I think, like hearing from students or hearing from colleagues that they learned something from one of the shows, and sometimes often in those early basic question sections where I might think it's basic, but they might know less, or sometimes the other way around. Like sometimes those questions elicit information that wouldn't have occurred to me. So I've been really happy that you insist on that.
We call those the dummy questions that are my job to ask. I mean, well, I would say exactly the same thing, Sugi, and about the guests that you brought on who were writers that I didn't know, but had read or admired, like Britt Bennett, and Gia Tolentino. Those are two early guests of ours. And Claire Bay Watkins. I mean, I think you booked all three of those guests, and those were really interesting writers to me that I was already interested in. And so that has been a consistent, you're really good at booking guests, and you've booked some great people on the show. And so I feel like we've meshed together and like, complemented each other in that way over time. The problem with guests, though, I think this is the most stressful thing, is like the booking of the guest, right? And why aren't guests more reliable? Why are
some guests are very reliable. I mean, everyone who's been on the show has been lovely. People's time works in different ways.
No, the ones we're talking about are the ones who have not been on the show. Those are the ones that make us sweat and cry and roll around on the floor. because
Will they show up?
Answer
Will they answer
emails. You don't know
emails?
what they're doing. You can't reach them. We stalk them on Facebook. Well, they posted. Maybe they're not going to answer the email. Like that's the bad.
We never do
situation.
that, by the way. We never
No,
do
I
what
made
Whitney's
that up.
describing.
It's
Is
a
definitely
story that I wrote.
But yeah, there have definitely been moments of like a little bit looking in the magic 8-ball to guess what the guest might be doing or thinking and how we can best make that person comfortable. And there's also the desire to make sure the guests are diverse, which I think is something that we've both worked really hard to achieve. Like that was one of my major goals coming into the show, both in terms of gender and race and sexual orientation and gender identity. I guess that's not of both, but rather in everything. And has been something that we were really focused on from early on.
Yeah, and when I'm looking back, and as we did to prepare for this episode, back through all of those episodes, looking at our guests, I feel like it was a useful conversation. And I think like to say, as we did so many times, and with students, because we have worked with students over the years that have been part of a podcasting class that I teach at UMKC, and we've had students from the University of Minnesota who have been interns. When we talk about guests with them and they're like, well, how about these two people? And we're like, well, they're both men. Could you find, how about if we, found a woman who could also speak to this topic? Or those writers are both white, how are we going to complicate that lineup, And having those conversations directly as part of an editorial meeting is important. I mean, it's not going to happen by magic. You have to be intentional about what you're doing if you want to have a diverse group of guests.
Yeah, and sometimes the students have been really helpful in that, also in generating names that we don't necessarily know, or they're reading differently than we are. And so actually working with your students has been really fun, and having students from here work on the show has also been great and has helped with that kind of diversity. And yeah, I think that, I feel like we talk about this every single week. I do remember even, early on having a very marathon conversation with you on the phone where like, my fiance went out of the apartment and then came back, and he's like, he had gone out like a long errand, and he was like, you are still on the phone with Whitney. And I was like, I 100% I am. He'd like gone on a tour of the town and returned to find me in that same conversation. But I think it has paid off.
What were we trying to book a guest or trying to decide who to ask for a particular episode? Do you remember what the conversation was about?
We were having a philosophical conversation about race.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we had a lot of those. Yeah. Okay. All right. So, but what about diversity in political viewpoint?
Are you asking if we should have had a Trumper on the show?
I'm really not. I mean, what would we have done? Right. I mean, I think as we've clearly documented on the podcast, which would never have needed to be documented on a podcast prior to this sort of moment in American history, like pro-authoritarian forces don't need a lot of airtime or any more than they're already getting on places like Fox or OAN or Newsmax,
Yeah. I mean, I do not come from the school of quote unquote, both sides need to be heard here. I am not for whataboutery, and basically feel like it's a subvariant of fuckery in general. So,
but there have been, when I think about political variation within the podcast, I do think there is a lot of variation within the left. I think we've had like someone like Bill Fletcher or Chavisa Woods on, who were, are progressive Bernie supporters, and I think we've had much more centrist, Democratic, centrist conservative, or even conservative Democrats on to talk about stuff. I feel like there's been a fairly wide distribution of stuff there, and it's not always stuff that I agree with. I mean, I voted for Bernie in the primaries, but that wasn't always the kind of people that we talked to. This isn't really a Bernie podcast.
No, I mean, I think we had a range of folks. Garrett Graff was Howard Dean's first webmaster back in the day.
No, I did not know that. That's interesting.
And Rebecca Solnit came on and spoke about Elizabeth Warren, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah.
We had a bunch of guests really talking about campaign 2020 in different ways.
Do we have anyone who really liked Biden?
Come to the virtual book channel to see my facial expression.
Well, we did not. Why do you think that is? Why would we? I can't imagine who would be the pro Biden. Look, I'm glad he won the election. And I also think, I don't think that like my candidate, Bernie, would necessarily have won that election given how close that it was.
Oh.
Do you?
Not necessarily. Yeah, I mean, not necessarily. I'm grateful for so many of the ways in which he shifted the conversation leftward, made so many major ideas that are even part of like regular Democratic Party discourse now originated, they were originally discussed as though they were far left-wing radical socialist ideas. And they're really not. But yeah, I think that Biden, I don't know. I think for all that it's very easy for people to do sort of an imitation of Biden, like this folksy dude from Delaware rides the Amtrak, all of that. But to me, he seemed like a bit of a cipher, like a vessel for other people's campaign ideas flowed toward him, and he seemed capable of containing them, perhaps. I mean, not to the degree that he wasn't exciting enough to kind of like I was never like, I can get 100% behind this dude. I believe I believe that he can get done what needs. I mean, I hope that he can get done what needs to get done. But he never inspired in me. I mean, I'm also like so happy that he was elected as opposed to the other horrific alternative. But yeah, I don't know. I think that like, I don't think that we had any guest on who was sort of like, Biden is really a once in a generation leader or anything like that.
I don't.
No,
it's a very strange situation, politically, where you feel like, okay, we narrowly avoided some kind of terrible disaster, but is this going to be just an interregnum where like the forces of authoritarianism are just going to come back stronger in the next election? And Biden's age is a problem. You don't see like, where is the future there, right? For the Democratic Party is a little bit harder to see for me. He seems like a throwback rather than a move forward. All right, so we can't rehash the entire 2020 election right now. I want to talk about the Fiction Nonfiction Awards.
Your idea. A very interesting idea. It's
hard.
Do
you not like this idea?
No, I like this idea. It's hard. It involves judgment. I'm very good at being judgy. It might piss people off, but making choices is a way of generating discussion.
Wouldn't it be great if there was somebody sitting around going, I did not win a Fiction Nonfiction Award. Boy, does that make me so mad. That would be good. Like all the people sitting around who didn't get any A's like me, feeling bad about it. All right. I have an idea for what we should call these awards.
Should I be happy or terrified?
Well, why don't you listen to my idea? I think we should call them the Nonnies. Huh? Huh?
Okay. So
something better?
I do not have anything better. I guess we can go with that. But whatever we call them, our first and honestly most important Nonnie will be the Shashank Murli We Don't Need No Education Award. This is given to the topic area that was most relevant to the Fiction Nonfiction podcast and thus the world over the past 4 years. The nominees are all up on our website under the By Topic for Educators tab, thanks to our former intern, Shashank Murli, who is a student at the University of Minnesota. You should all visit this tab, by the way, especially, obviously, if you're an educator. If you liked this episode of the podcast, you might also want to assign this one kind of scenario. And they are, drumroll please, COVID-19, climate change, industry insider, race, and gender and sexuality. Is there anything there that you would like to add?
I mean, I think I understand why we group those on the website in that way. And I think that makes sense to me. I would add, the only thing that I would add, sorry, you can hear me paging through my notes, is that I think like authoritarianism was something that we did a good job of covering, and that we wrote about authoritarianism and the forces of authoritarianism rising in Sri Lanka, in India, in Poland, in the United States, in Myanmar, and in Hong Kong. Am I missing anything?
I don't think so.
Those are the ones I remember specifically talking about.
Yeah.
That's a lot of episodes, and a lot of the Trump related stuff was really sort of about authoritarianism and what it meant and how he was not impersonating, but adopting sort of ideas of authoritarianism that, this wasn't clear from the beginning of his presidency that that's what was going on, or that it was linked up to other countries. I mean, when we did that episode with Steve Yarbrough about the rise of authoritarianism in Poland, which was fairly early on, I had no idea. And I found that one of the most scary episodes that we did, because I did not understand that this movement was happening already in a country as large as Poland and recently democratic. And, you learned about it. Oh, the same thing's happening in Hungary. And that started to feel like a growth of a movement that I don't think is over. And so I feel like that was I don't know if that's the most important topic, but I would include that in our group.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I also was thinking about, I don't know if this exactly falls under that umbrella, but your friend Tom Frank came on the show a couple times and talked about populism, which connected to my understanding of authoritarianism in interesting ways. I found that episode to be really illuminating, to think about the ways and the meanings of populism being inverted over time through history, and the ways that Trump was and wasn't a populist in the original way was surprising to me. But yeah, I think, and of course, like doing the Sri Lanka related one, we got to have some amazing reporters on the show, which I was so happy about. I mean, the show obviously features a lot of fiction writers, poets, but then I think pairing that with reporters and letting the reporters who don't often get to talk about their thoughts on craft in the same way that, talking about craft is the bread and butter of creative writing a lot of the time. And I don't know that journalists get invited to talk about that sort of stuff on a show like ours that often. And so making space for that, I learned a lot about how I might think about writing about authoritarianism or race and gender, or, leaderless movements like the one in Hong Kong. I remember Javi Hernandez talking about what it meant to try to write about a movement that was trying very self-consciously to not have like an icon at its head, and to think about those ideas and apply them to fiction. That has been really satisfying for me, almost regardless of which topic we were talking about. I found that I was able to take that away from almost everyone. But I think, what do you think was the most covered or most important?
Well, I mean, I can remember different episodes for each. I mean, we're going to talk about Richard Preston in a minute. When I thought we had like a really good episode with him that sort of predicted what was going to happen with COVID-19. And then we had a lot of episodes, like there was a Denez Smith episode that was really good about like living under quarantine that I liked. We've had Nathaniel Rich to talk about climate change, and oh my God, is it Juliana Spar?
Yeah, exactly. The poet Juliana Spar.
Her episode was really good.
Were they two halves of the same episode?
Were they the same? I'd have to go back and look.
They might have been, yeah.
And that's not the only climate change stuff that we've done.
I loved Emily Rabideau stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, that's who I was thinking of. Right. Emily Rabideau, we talked to her about. But I still think like, the thing that this podcast is signature talked about is like race and American society, and race and how it affects the way people write. We've talked about it in the publishing industry. We've talked about it in policing. We've talked about it from the very first episode, which was about Colin Kaepernick, all the way up through our last episode with Adam Serwer. And so the fact that this podcast comes out of, in fact, our friendship with and learning from James Allen McPherson, and this is something that Jim was always constantly talking about as the centrality. If you want to understand American society, you got to think about it in terms of race. I feel like that to me is our biggest through line.
I would agree with that. And I think that, and I guess we'll talk to Jabari about this a little bit shortly, but yeah, I think that.
So yeah, that's why Jabari's coming on, because we already decided that this was the winning category. There's a little false suspense here. This is what we want. This is what we think is the one.
Behind the curtain.
They won.
There is no wizard. But first, you wanted to give a Nonnie out, I think, or perhaps you had some nominations. You were talking about Richard Preston.
Okay, I have another Nonnie. Our next Nonnie is the Richard Preston Terrifyingly Accurate Prediction Award. Richard Preston came on our show to talk about COVID in early 2020, and he said this.
If the virus should come to the United States or to anywhere, I rather think that it's going to be something like a bad flu. We're not talking about something that's going to cause a breakdown of society or the end of the world. I really don't see that coming at all. But I see the possibility of a new and perhaps entrenched human disease that we can't get rid of now that it's gotten into us, except through vaccination. So what do you do in a situation like that? Well, I think you do self-quarantine. If you can stay at home, if you've got enough to live on, that's what you do when the plague is going around. That's what they did in London in 1665 during the Great London Plague. People stay at home, and the streets of the city become empty and quiet in a time of plague, just as the streets of Wuhan now are quiet. I don't know whether or not the streets of New York will go quiet if coronavirus comes around, but it's something that I think we all kind of have to keep in mind, which is the continuity of human history and the basic thing, which is the human condition. And despite all of the science that we have, all of the medicine that we have, in the face of an emerging virus, something new coming out of nature for which we have no vaccine and no treatment, we are reduced to simply a collection of human bodies with no more protection for us than doctors in the 19th century had for diseases like tuberculosis.
Well, holy shit, that definitely qualifies as a terrifying and accurate prediction. I remember being totally blown away by basically everything Richard said, and I was already horrified. But since the award is named for Richard, he can't win. So these are the somewhat arbitrarily determined rules of the Nonnie.
Well, if the award's named for you, you've already won.
So who are your nominees?
Well, okay. I have one that might sound a little surprising to you, but this was from Sarah Krasikov, and this was a relatively
Sana Krasikov, maybe.
What?
Sana Krasikov?
Okay, sorry. Yes, I wrote it down wrong. All right, so I'll say this again. So yeah. I have one that you might be a little surprising, but I thought this was something that Sana Krasikov said in an early episode on November 16th, 2017. It's our 4th episode from season 1. And here's her quote.
Our attempt to try to delegitimize an unpopular president by saying that Russia kind of caused him to triumph. To me, that's sort of the other side of the conspiracy thinking coin. Even if they did all those things, like nobody forced people to go into the voting booths and vote the way they did. I mean, that's on us. Like, if we want to reckon with our choices, then we have to reckon with our choices.
Yeah. The other thing that Sana said that might qualify her for the terrifyingly accurate prediction award, she talked about, I wonder if I'm going to remember this quote exactly. She talked about interior alienation, kind of like giving up on your society and what that would mean for people. And
I feel like we're seeing interior alienation in my state right now because we're having a giant COVID spike despite the fact that vaccines are available for everyone and people just don't want to do it for some reason.
Yeah, I think that like everything that she said in that episode, and Sana is an Iowa classmate of mine. And just like her canniness and political analysis and understanding of people's ability to lie to themselves about things like that. I just felt like that was, she was so on.
Well, the reason I chose her quote though, is because at the time that Russia thing, this was before Trump was impeached, right? And so she is saying like, this is a dead end. We need to talk about why people really voted this way. Yeah. And that turned out to have a lot to do with race and a lot of the stuff that we've talked about. And I think that is now the consensus. And I don't think that that people look back and think, oh, the election was stolen by the Russians. I think that's gone now. And I think she was right about that.
I agree that we have to reckon with our choices. I do also think that Republican willingness to look away from the very clear signs of Russian interference are evidence of GOP moral bankruptcy. And it's an important piece in like a very large puzzle, but it's a large piece. And so I remember just sort of like, right, I don't know, I'm not sort of the like Rocky IV, Red Dawn, like Red Scare. I mean, yes, I grew up in the 1980s. I watched all those movies, but like, I'm not in it to like just sort of revive that anti-Russia bandwagon. Like, I'm not interested in that. But I also think like, how can you look away from the evidence of what really happened, right? Like that was a Senate Intelligence Committee report run by Republicans. And then like the majority of the party like looked away from it. So I agree that like, Russians are not the rot at the center of our society. That's definitely true. But willingness to look away from clear evidence of foreign interference in our elections is evidence of the rot in our society. Like people will do anything. People will do anything to like hang on to that power, including ignoring something that's very obviously against the national interest. I say this as someone who's like not always right. I don't know. I'm not like a patriot who's like gonna jump on like the greatness of the nation state.
And I have one other nomination. This comes from C. Riley Snorton, who was a guest of ours in March 7th, 2019. And here is this line, which this is not so much like a terrifying prediction, but it's an interesting prediction.
If we think about the transitive use of a verb in grammar, it refers to a verb that requires a direct object to fix its meaning. Right. So while on one hand, trans can often mean, trans often invokes a form of movement, from one place to the next, passing into a different kind of condition. But I also was very invested in thinking about when we look at trans, what needs to be put in place in order for us to understand that something trans is happening. And that's how I was really thinking about Blackness and transness as working together, namely that the kind of ungendering of Blackness in the antebellum period of the U.S. gives us a sense of this lack of anatomical and symbolic coherence. It also gives us a sense of the mutability of gender.
That's a complicated quote. C. Riley is an academic and speaks in academic terms, but that idea of connecting transness to Blackness and the way that that was done in that episode, I thought was really important and interesting and made me think about the way that we're going to think about gender in the future in different ways.
Yeah, I think that was a really strong episode. And I was going to say, like, I mean, I should have mentioned academics before among the very valuable categories of guests that we've had. I mean, I think that wasn't necessarily part of our original conception, and we eventually did invite guests from academia on, and I feel like it really enriched discussion in ways that I found valuable. Yeah, C. Riley Snorton was a great nominee. So do we have to pick a winner?
Well, do you have any nominees, or am I doing this all by myself?
In terms of terrifyingly accurate predictions, I feel like one of the through lines of, we've often asked our guests to make predictions. It's often been a way that we have ended the show. And like, what do you think lies ahead for your topic? And often people have been like, well, what can I say? Bleakness, despair. Yeah. And like, often when they have said that, they've been right. And like a lot of the ones about authoritarianism were ones that I found to be like Mira Srinivasan. I'm trying to like her comments about rising nationalism in Sri Lanka. I am not sure if I'm allowed to nominate my friends or what the rules of the Nonnie are on that.
Of course you can.
I would nominate Mira for canny political analysis of rising nationalism in South Asia, right? Like when she came on the show, that was pre-pandemic, and we saw nationalism play out in the pandemic response, right? We saw that taking just a grotesque, like it's just a horrific toll that's going on even now. So I think she would be one of my nominees for sure. Okay. And then I think that maybe the other one would probably be, well, I don't know that it's, can I nominate Jabari when he's going to come on? I feel like it's a spoiler.
Sure.
But like there were a lot of folks who like, I would sort of be like, has progress been made? And they would be like, rein it in there. And yeah, anytime someone was, you'd be sort of like, has the needle moved? And they'd be like, very, very, very slightly. So actually, in addition to Jabari, I'll say Aisha Pandey, who came on for an Industry Insider episode and talked about racism. Like that was an episode that was very close to my heart and that I spent a lot of time thinking about. And I knew a lot of what Aisha might say before she came on. I had my suspicions, and then she came on and said it. And it was like a dagger of.
And she said that one of the things she said was that, and I know, well, we've already recorded our interview with Jabari, so we know that we're going to actually bring this up again. But she mentioned this idea that, okay, you might think that there are more opportunities for writers of color now, but there already has been a cycle like this that happened, and then all of it dried up and went away. And so I don't know that you can view that as like, you know, the arc of history bending toward justice in this place.
Yeah. And like another way to think about like S.J. Sindhu came on and spoke about how it's very difficult as a writer to be considered as an entire person, as having multiple identities, you know, being South Asian and queer and, you know, what else? And like, maybe you're a South Asian and queer and disabled or Black and trans and so to occupy multiple categories, the publishing industry and marketing don't always have ways to talk about that. And then I was thinking about that when Akwaeke Emezi was recently, their book came out, their new book, Dear Sundharan, which is a memoir, a Black spirit memoir. And it talks about being an embodied God, as I understand it. So they were saying, you know, their previous books had been marked by identity categories that they felt did not necessarily pertain to them. And I thought of Sindhu as someone who was able to, I don't know if that counts as predicting, but able to name something ahead of when other people were necessarily talking about it in the same way. I think like probably not totally alone, but I appreciated the way that she articulated that.
All right, so we have to just say who we are going to vote for. Who would you vote for of those nominees?
I like what you said about Sana. I think you might have convinced me.
All right, I'll go with Sana too.
All right, Sana Krasikov.
Yes, we'll send her a note.
Inaugural Nonnie.
she gets a candy bar. All right, we got to get through these. We're going long already. Okay. All right, you have the next one. No, well, I do. I'm sorry.
You do.
All right. This is the most important Nonnie of all. This is the Gail Miles Moss and Lulu Levy Terrell Why Can't Everyone Interrupt Whitney as Easily as We Do award, and is given to the guest who could best interrupt me.
Or the guest who best resisted your interrupting them.
Who was impervious to interruption.
Who just filibustered you. And I would nominate Jane Coaston, who, as I recall, preceded. And also Gish Jen, who
is the winner.
Yes. I think that I cannot. I love Gish.
I would also nominate Bill Fletcher, who was like washing dishes while he did the interview with us, or somebody was in the background and made it. Do you remember that part of that?
He was great.
He was in his kitchen.
He was funny. Like, let me tell you. And I think, I appreciated those. The next Nonnie I have on the list is the Gordon Lish Award for the guest most able to make me speak in short, conclusive sentences.
Another easy, we don't need any other nominations, Madeleine Miller.
Oh, really?
And I'll tell you why, because we did that interview with her about her fantastic novel, Circe, live in front of an audience. And when you're live in front of an audience, you speak shorter.
Oh, fascinating. I feel like I'm in podcast therapy.
That's all. It's just like, there's something about the audience. I don't know what it is, but it's different.
Okay.
All right. So those were easy awards to give out. We'll send them their candy bars. I don't know what kind. Nestle's maybe. And now we have the ever popular With You and Me, James Allen McPherson Memorial Guest Who Actually Read Our Books Award. That's the Nonnie for that. These are not always the same people. So I guess we could nominate the guest who read your books and the guest who read my books. And I'm kind of curious, like, do you feel like as podcast, the one thing that's been different, I sometimes think is like, I worry, I don't know if this is true. Do you think people stop seeing us as writers and start seeing us as podcast hosts because we're on doing podcasts all the time? And, we don't publish a book as often as we do podcasts.
I don't know. I mean, I think, I'm not sure. I guess I have tried not to worry about that because I can't control it. And as a general policy, I attempt to not worry about things I can't control. But I don't know. I think like we ask questions that are driven by interests that arise out of our own work.
I also feel like sometimes we bring up our work and people are like, oh, you wrote a book. We legitimately surprise guests by bringing up the fact that, oh, Sugi wrote this book, Love Marriage. Oh, really? Oh, I didn't. Yeah. There's conspicuous silence on the other end. Yeah, we're going to just move on because I didn't know that.
I think that, but then, we bring on, like say, Marianne Mohan Raj or S.J. Sindhu or Mathangi Subramanian or Mira Srinivasan, or like Javier Hernandez.
Those are people who I feel like definitely had read, were unfamiliar with your work, which I really appreciate. I think it's nice for a guest to at least know, who the hosts are. I would say the same thing. And again, these are like my friends, right? So, Tracy K. Smith or Chang Ray Lee or Margot Livesey, Tom Frank, Jess Rao, Gerald Walker, all those are people who I feel like are really reciprocal in a way that I appreciate.
Yeah. And I think I remember after she was on the show, Sarah Paretsky looked up our work and wrote me like such a nice note.
Which was super nice.
She was so nice. Yeah, she was really great.
Because we didn't know her at all.
Yeah. And she was like a dream. You were like, I would love to have Sarah Paretsky on. You'd say like once a month. And it was such a thrill to have her. And then to discover that she was also such a kind person. And now the Tiare Jones, I can't believe we landed this guest, Nonnie Award. Did you freeze?
I wish that I could say it was Kareem Abdul-Jabbar because we almost landed Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. I still want to have him on the show.
The dream is not dead. So who are your nominees?
Well, Sarah Paretsky. I would mention Marlon James and Daniel Jose Older, but I don't know if we get credit for that because they were booked as part of like a literary festival in Minneapolis. We didn't really land them.
Thank you, Steph Opitz. And I would say I would have to nominate Candace Bushnell. We had one of your students who just like cold wrote Candace Bushnell, which was awesome. And Candace Bushnell was like, yes, I will be on the fiction nonfiction podcast. And yes, if I could, if the sound of my jaw dropping had a sound, that would be my nominee. Edwige Danticat, who is also, fantastic, and to whom we
had a little in from thanks to John Freeman and the NYU writing program with her, but that she was
okay. Great. I don't think I knew that, but yeah. I was like, I cannot believe she's going to be on the show.
Well, I had been, this is back in the old days when we could go to other countries. I had been in France. My wife teaches a study abroad program for UMKC. I had gone and spoken at the NYU program in Paris and had met Edwige Danticat, who was doing the same thing, and had asked her, about being on the show. And then we wrote her and she did it. I asked her sitting on a barge in the Seine, which is this cool end of semester thing that the NYU program does. And I got to do, because I happened to be there at that time, drinking champagne.
Whitney's life is hard, folks.
It was definitely the last time I was on a barge drinking champagne in Paris. I vote for Candace Bushnell.
Yeah, that was just, because it didn't even come from either one of us. It was just like, it was wild. Your student was like, Candace Bushnell emailed me back, or like her people emailed me back. And we were just, wow. Okay. So who would we most want to book in the future? Do you have a dream episode or dream guest?
I feel like we have both talked about Stephen King.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be awesome?
I would actually, I've probably talked about this to a lot of people. I don't know if I've ever discussed it. I'm like a big fan of Tabitha King, Stephen King's wife. And I would be hugely excited to, when I was like a teenager, one of my favorite novels was by Tabitha King. It was a basketball novel, which I just read endlessly. And they, like the King family has, Susan Dominus wrote this great New York Times Magazine story about like the King family and their writing and all their references to each other. It'd be super fun to interview them together.
I was at a party the other night and somebody was talking to me about one of my books and how it was hard, which it is. Good Lieutenant is, goes backwards, and he's like,
backwards.
And he was like, well, then I read a book by Stephen King, and it was just, basically, he was just like, he wanted to say it was just so much better. I was like, thank you. Stephen King's a really good writer. Yes, he is. He's also less hard than I am and probably more exciting, more fun for you to read. Sorry, that's just the way it goes.
The satisfactions of reading Whitney and reading Stephen King are just slightly different, just a little. Yeah, I mean, I also am. Did you write anything I would have heard of? Yes. Like I'm also not known for being quote unquote easy, but I think, I don't know, he would be a great guest. I would love to talk to him about horror and about accessibility and writing about music.
Do you know who I would also like to have on? Because I am friends with Kevin Wilmot, who is a screenwriter here at KU, who wrote the screenplay for Black Klansman. And he has worked a lot with Spike Lee. And I think it'd be really fun to have Spike Lee on.
With Kevin Wilmot?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no way that's going to happen.
I'm available to tape this episode.
That's what I would like.
I want to have Colson Whitehead on.
Oh, yeah. We could actually get Colson Whitehead, I think.
Should we edit this out?
No, let's try. This is an open invitation.
I just, I think,
now we've mentioned all men. We're gonna have to redo this.
I would like to have Jesse on. I would like to have and then so many of our guests have been wonderful to come multiple times. Like Alex Chi has joined us a couple times. Oscar Villon. So I think also sometimes once someone comes on, it starts a conversation that we're able to continue. So finally, for viewers of our YouTube channel and IGTV videos, we have the Sue Monk Kid. What is that in the background, Nonnie?
Yeah, that's because if you see our video, Sue Monk Kid has the best writer background of all. Very beautiful, immaculate bookshelves that I've put together like my own bullshit facsimile of them here, but they're not nearly as nice. But I did that after seeing hers, and I was like, oh my God, we got my back. I was like hunched in, it was when we were first starting to do video, and I was like hunched in my bedroom, and the shadows were all weird, and the camera was angular, was pointed into the angle of the wall and not the flat wall, and it looked terrible. And all of us have been trying to figure out our backgrounds. You've totally changed your background several times.
Yeah, I mean, I think I didn't have a consistent space in my house, and now I'm in a closet. I'm in a walk-in closet. Here's the confession. It is a very stylish,
not a sound studio
walk-in closet. My dog not only knows how to open the door and come in, but as we will discover later in the same episode, knows how to, when I bring her in the office to be quiet, she knows how to open the door and leave when she wants to, and how to weirdly close the door behind her. I'm gonna have to go look at the video replay for that. And then the other person with an awesome background that I always appreciate is Beth Nguyen, who has a sequined Keanu pillow behind, she's immaculate bookshelf. I'm trying to remember if we had Beth on video or not. She has an immaculate bookshelf, and then the sequined Keanu pillow. So it's this disruption of the expectation. Keanu is always with her, which I need to come up with some piece of flair that is like that.
I don't think we did her on video when we had her on the show. I think that was pre-pandemic, but I'm happy to give her the award.
Keanu pillow. I mean, come on.
Okay.
Well, now that we've given out all of our wildly lucrative and prestigious Nonnie Awards, we're going to talk to Jabari Asim. An accomplished poet, playwright, and writer, Jabari Asim has served as the editor-in-chief of Crisis Magazine, the NAACP's flagship journal of politics, culture, and ideas, and as an editor at the Washington Post, where he wrote a syndicated column on politics, popular culture, and social issues. His writing has appeared in Essence, The Baffler, the LA Times, the New York Times, the New Republic, American Prospect, Yale Review, and elsewhere. He's the recipient of a Guggenheim and the author of 7 books for adults, including We Can't Breathe, On Black Lives, White Lies, and the Art of Survival, and 11 books for children. His debut book of poems, Stop and Frisk, was published in 2020. Jabari teaches at Emerson College, where he directs the MFA program. Jabari, welcome back to the show.
Glad to be here.
How long have you been directing that program?
6 years.
Man.
And I've been at Emerson 11 years. So I'm about to start my 12th year in the fall.
I had my first year of directing our program here, and it is really hard. I'm impressed that you've been doing it for that long.
Yeah, me too. Well, check with me in a year and see how I feel.
Okay.
Oh my God.
You and Terrion Williamson were our guests on a June 2020 episode titled Black Stories Matter. That was shortly after the police murder of George Floyd and right at the beginning of the uprisings that took place in Minneapolis and around the globe in the wake of that crime. After handing out our 100th episode Fiction Nonfiction Awards earlier, before we had you on, which I'm going to call I want to call the Nonnies, but we're still workshopping that. Sugi and I decided that the issues we discussed in the episode that you were on were probably the most important through line the entire time that we've had this podcast, all through the 100 episodes.
Yeah, we started our very first episode by listing the names of Black men who'd been shot by the police. And the godfather of our show is our former professor, James Allen McPherson, who taught Whitney and I separately, and shared many of the same texts with us and taught a lot about the through line of race in American life and history.
Which is why we wanted to have you back for this 100th episode. And one of the things we talked about when we spoke to you, and we've talked about with a lot of other guests like Matt Johnson and Britt Bennett and Victor Laval and Dennis Smith, Dwayne Betts, Timothy Yu, and most recently Adam Serwer, we talked about narrative and how narrative has represented race and policing. And I wondered, that's something that we discussed a lot on the episode that you were on. And I wonder if you feel like these norms of narrative and the way we think about narrative on this particular issue has shifted during the year that passed since you were on the show in a positive or negative way.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I guess one of the operative words there, though, is we. When we talk about, do we look at the narrative differently? I mean, if you look at African Americans, we've always looked at the narrative differently. And as far as mainstream America, it seems to be still very much divided politically. So I don't necessarily think that our efforts to shift the narrative have really moved the needle as much as would be necessary. But we are seeing some little indications. For example, in some of the media reports of late, I've seen reporters and editors more willing to say racist, for example, as opposed to allegedly racist or alleged racist comments. I'm now with growing frequency seeing racist comments labeled merely as racist comments or racist behavior. This is a small thing, but if you're African American and you've been monitoring this kind of discourse for some time, you notice these shifts, and that's very different. And it's connected to, I think, partly newsrooms responding to calls for diversity. And you have to qualify those calls for diversity. We don't just mean reporters of color. We mean people in decision-making positions of color, and who can make a call on a headline, who can make a call on a description of behavior or commentary. And I think that's where you're seeing the influence, where the narrative is being regarded somewhat differently. So small indications like that, that there are some changes, but by no means should those indications be read as, in my view, as a substantial movement of the needle.
Yeah, I was listening to the episode that we taped with you last year, and I noticed that you mentioned the date 1619. You didn't specifically reference the 1619 project that Nikole Hannah-Jones led, but you mentioned that date, and I was thinking about how over the past year, I've heard that date more and more, and I was trying to decide if I could count that as one of the norms shifting. And of course, in recent days, we've seen Nikole Hannah-Jones go through really racist treatment from the Board of Trustees and a donor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where she had initially been recruited for a tenured position, a night chair in journalism. And, she decided to go to Howard, which is an HBCU. And I just was thinking, as I was listening to our previous conversation about all of everything that you'd said about, kind of who is the audience, who has access to write, and like, what do those norms mean and who are they for? And her sort of dramatic, really profoundly moving decision to go to Howard, at least, I mean, for me, it was sort of like she was saying that she didn't have to, it wasn't her job to fix that norm.
Yeah, she also expressed an exhaustion, of having to devote so much energy to proving that she belonged in these white spaces, and she didn't want to do that anymore. And as a longtime African American journalist, of course, I can totally relate to that. The other good side of her movement to Howard University is that it does shine a necessary light on the type of journalism that's being developed in places like Howard University, Hampton University, and most notably, I would say Morgan State University in Baltimore, where they have a really world-class African-American-led journalism program, and they're turning out really talented people who are going to do that work in terms of shifting the narrative. But of course, the hostility toward Nikole Hannah-Jones, really derives from this this fury that she has stirred up by daring to so openly want to change the narrative in terms of the relationship between white supremacy and American history. And of course, we need to point out that an African American at the top of the masthead at the New York Times helped make that possible. There's now an African American at the top of the masthead at the Los Angeles Times. People who can make the ultimate call. So that's beginning to happen, but it's all overdue. It's so overdue, and so I don't want us to waste a lot of energy patting ourselves on the back and talking about how far we've come when we have so far to go.
Well, the other thing that sorry, Sue, do you have?
No, go ahead.
Okay, the thing that I noticed this year that has changed since you were on the show is that there was like an acceptance and like recognition of this narrative that we're talking about, like the 1619 Project got a ton of attention, but now there's a backlash, and the conservative forces have engaged with this narrative. They want to put it away, quiet it, turn it away, stop it. They've understood that it's dangerous to them and to their goals, right? Honesty and truth is a problem for them, right? And so, you have a lot of criticism. That's where the criticism of critical race theory and the critical race theory has become a bogeyman and shows up on, Tucker Carlson's show all the time. We were just talking about this last week. And you have a reaction against, the author of the 1619 Project, who we're just talking about. I'm forgetting her name right now. Nikole, what's her last name again?
Hannah Jones.
Nikole Hannah-Jones, who is, as Tuki was just outlining, like the board of trustees at UNC were conservative and didn't want her to give her tenure specifically because she was engaged in that project. So like there's a real battle now over this narrative.
Yeah, but it's an ongoing battle.
It's always been a battle. You're right.
Yeah, from the earliest African-American journalists, John Russwurm, Frederick Douglass, Ida B. Wells, that's exactly what they were doing. So Nikole Hannah-Jones is doing wonderful work, but really following in their footsteps. And that resistance has always been there. Those journalists met that same resistance that she is meeting now. So it's a continuing struggle.
So last year you said, and I'm quoting here, the weight of societal custom shapes our portrayals. And I'm curious about how you think the conversations and events of last summer, like we talked to you sort of right at the beginning of the uprisings following the murder of George Floyd. And since then, many, many, many things have happened. I'm curious about how you think the conversations and events of last summer and what happened after are beginning to appear in our culture, and how important it will be in the long run that Derek Chauvin was convicted and sentenced to jail.
That's a lot, Sugi.
Crammed it all in there. It's a clown car of a question.
We have 1 minute.
Well, I don't know. It's important to note that, shortly after George Floyd was killed, Elijah McClain was shot to death by police. Jacob Blake was shot and left paralyzed by police. So, there's rhetoric and then there's actual consequences. There's actual changes in police behavior. And the jury is still very much out on that. And I think that it's common sense for African Americans to regard any hint of PR in the direction of police becoming more sensitive with healthy skepticism. And so I would say that it's very early in terms of the post George Floyd period for us to be making large scale assessments. I think we just need to be open eyed and continue the struggles to create and implement systems in which police are actually responsible to their alleged constituencies.
So last time we were talking about cowboy narratives and the way that also people tell stories to let themselves off the hook. And I hope, and maybe this is just an aspirational hope, that one of the things I am seeing slightly is narrative, even mainstream narrative, getting messier, less conclusive,
Yeah.
More willing to accept a real world in which things are untidy, unfair. I think of, like narratives like The Hate U Give, which of course had come out before that, but other stories like last time we spoke about The Watchmen, and Derek Chauvin was convicted. And then, as you say, there's such a lack of accountability in so many other ways. This morning I was scrolling through my timeline and I saw a story that was sort of like cop PR about a police officer arresting a DoorDash driver, but then completing his order. And I was like, I don't care.
Right.
I epically do not care about this. I was like, how did this make it into the newspaper?
Yeah.
And I just like the sort of narrative around who the police are does seem to be moving away from that kind of tidiness, or like one man can save the day.
Yeah, no question. I totally agree with you. And I think another area of improvement that I've seen is that, there's so many initial reports in mainstream newspapers when there is a police shooting that seem to almost copy the police report word for word. But so many of these reports have been exposed as the fiction that they are, that newspapers are beginning to put that kind of language and that kind of scrutiny into those initial reports, and on television as well. So I agree with you. I think that is a positive step. And I think your word messy is appropriate. I mean, they're taking more care to disclose the messiness of the circumstances surrounding these shootings and how long it takes to actually ascertain the facts.
We discussed publishing industry and journalism and how diverse or not diverse it was with a lot of guests over the years of this podcast: Jennifer Baker, Aisha Pandey, Mira Jacob, Jess Rao, just to name a few. Anecdotally, among Facebook friends, I know that Jennifer has moved on to an editorial position at Amistad Books, which is a part of HarperCollins, and Lisa Lucas recently became senior vice president at FnF Doubleday after heading the National Book Awards. What's your feeling about the status of diversity in publishing, in awards, and in reviewing these days?
Well, certainly in awards and reviewing, we're definitely seeing more diversity. But just to touch for a minute on diversity within the publishing houses, you named some people. I just want to point out, I think it's important to remember that late 90s, even as recent as 2000, there were 7 or 8 imprints at mainstream publishing houses that were created to address the needs of African-American writers and readers and adjacent people who were interested. They included One World, Amistad, Jump at the Sun, Strivers Row, Walk Worthy, Harlem Moon, and I think there were even others. Right now, I believe of those, Amistad is still standing, and possibly One World. So we had this conversation 20 years ago, and we said, and the other similarity is those imprints were run by brilliant Black women in publishing. Anita Diggs, Janet Hill, Melody Guy, Andrea Davis Pinckney, some of the smartest minds in publishing were brought in to run those imprints. And we were very excited and we were very happy. We were saying, this is diversity in publishing. We're getting there. We have smart people in these positions. Those imprints are gone. History is sort of repeating itself with these publishers now saying, in wake of George Floyd, in wake of Black Lives Matter, we see you Black readers, we see you Black writers and editors. We're going to do it again. And obviously they did something wrong the first time, or it was window dressing, or it was PR. And so I think if we are informed by recent publishing history, we have to regard all of this with healthy skepticism and say it's way too soon to celebrate it.
That's so interesting, because that is exactly what Aisha said when she was on the show. Sugi, do you remember this? She said, look, we've gone through this period of expansion before, and then it gets cut back. I don't view this necessarily as a lasting change.
Yeah. Yeah, it's way too early to see. And it also, I mean, those books are dependent upon how well they are promoted within African American constituencies and outside of African American constituencies. You know, there's a phrase in the Black community: there's Black people famous and there's white people famous, right? So there are writers who are celebrated in our communities, and then, you know, after their 8th book, you know, they publish a book and white people go, wow, look at this new author. This is great. We love her, you know, and she's been doing this work a long time. So, and to me, that points to the shortcomings of publishing and publishing professionals. So I'm always going to be a pretty harsh critic of their performance, because, you know, if it were a report card, they'd get a C-. So let's see where that goes. In terms of diversity and awards, one reason we're seeing greater diversity is because the judges are more diverse than they used to be, and that's very positive. I think a number of my friends and colleagues who are also writers have served as judges in recent years, and I think that's pretty wonderful. What was the other part we did? Reviews. Yeah, I'm totally noticing the diversity of reviewers. Especially in the New York Times. It's really changed in the last year or so, and I think it's great. The other thing they're doing differently is they're not just assigning, say, African American reviewers to review books by African American writers. They're going beyond that, and that's kind of new. It's kind of new, and it's refreshing, and I hope it continues.
Yeah, I agree. Like, I felt like there was a period of time where I could sort of pin, you know, I'd be like, oh, debut woman writer of color will be reviewed by freelance critic, also
Yes.
woman of color,
Yes,
perhaps with ostensible cultural similarity, but perhaps no deep understanding.
Yeah, there you go.
You know,
That's
I
it.
was that critic a couple times.
Yeah.
Like, I can remember, like getting assigned to review like books connected to India,
Yes.
where there would be like an assumption that I had some understanding, and maybe I had like marginally more, but my family's Sri Lankan Tamil, and so I wasn't always making it there. And so yeah, and then, you know, also you're talking about like judging, right? So many of these, I just always remember, I mean, publishing is an industry that's it's run by English majors. And so then you have all this, right, the sort of boutique, these jobs that for so long assumed that people could afford not to be paid. And even certain book review assignments can be like that. Judging is often, right, it's termed a labor of love.
Right.
Like that's not exactly right. Like someone's paying, you know, you're paying with your time, and then you're not being compensated. So the ability, people sort of moving to make those even nominally compensated, I think has been helpful. And the diversity of assignments that you're talking about, I think I really have appreciated, like sometimes to be like a really smart take from someone who has an affinity for a text that wouldn't be obvious, or that is, dare I say, like aesthetic and not necessarily just based on like assumed cultural similarity, has been a joy.
You know, I assigned those reviews for years, you know, as an editor at Washington Post Book World, and it's a fine line. I remember being a contributor to an anthology of work by young Black writers. This was years ago, and I was a young Black writer at the time. And I remember reading this one review, and I just couldn't, it was in a major publication. I couldn't figure out how this particular white man was assigned to review an anthology of young Black men writing on love and violence, I think was the theme of the anthology. And I couldn't figure it out. So it's tough, because the editor might have said, well, I don't want to pigeonhole this book. I don't want to, you know, assign a young Black male writer who writes about love and violence, because, you know, he might say, oh, why are you calling me? Is this the only thing I can review? You know, so, but then on the other hand, you can go too far in the other direction, and the reviewer knows absolutely nothing about, you know, what he's been asked to comment on. So it's tough. I'm sympathetic because I've been on both sides of that fence.
Yeah, and I think this just gets back to the messiness I was talking about before, which of course is also a thing in our political lives. So going to switch tacks here to politics. So when we last spoke, my God, Trump was president, and now it's Biden, and he won with significant support from the Black community, particularly in the now famous South Carolina primary, and he chose a Black vice president. He promised to nominate a Black woman to the Supreme Court. But how has he done in terms of promoting specific reforms to policing nationally, and what should he be doing that he isn't?
Well, I don't think I think he's been pretty tepid. particularly even in engaging the conversation or the concept or the possibility of defund the police and what that means. On the other hand, I never expected anything else from him. I mean, this is the dilemma of the African American voter. I mean, for the most part, the Republican Party is repulsive. The Democratic Party depends on us, but takes us for granted once we get them in office. I didn't expect anything different from him or from his vice president, frankly. So I'm not sure what he will do. I don't think he's done much so far. But you know, I'm an intellectual. I read and write books. So my impulse is always to say he needs to read. He needs to consult with people who are doing this work in the field. People like Ruth Ann Gilmore. There's a brilliant book out right now called Halfway Home by Reuben Miller. There are these people. They think about this all day, and they know so much more about it than say I do. And I think there needs to be ways for people in government to engage the thoughts and the research of the people who are out there doing the work. I'm not seeing that so far.
So Jabari, I listen to all kinds of podcasts about politics in order to prepare for this show, including ones that I don't necessarily agree with. And so I listen to this as what I would call the old white guy podcast, but they're still Democrats. So this is like James Carville and Al Hunt, who are two war horses of like the, sort of centrist Democratic movement. And they really hate defund the police, and they talk about it every single episode of their show. And I think that this narrative has started to gain momentum in sort of centrist Democratic and probably also mostly white circles, right? Where they're pointing at the New York mayoral election, where a guy who was Black but opposed that narrative won, and they're saying, look, Democrats can't talk about this, it's going to kill them in the midterms, all this sort of stuff. So I want to play a passage of them talking about this and then see how you react and what you think about what they're saying. Okay.
Your podcast. All right, James, let's start with the issue of crime. Violent crime declining for years has seen an uptick.
Can you hear it?
In the final
Yes.
12 years and indications of a surge this year in big cities, at least New York, Chicago. And Republicans, while decrying this, are actually celebrating. They see this as a big winner for them. It strikes me it's a legitimate worry that Democrats are divided and even incoherent on this. There's still a defund the police part of the Democrats, not very big, but they make a lot of noise. That's not a very welcome message in a crime surge.
No, it's not. And it is a small minority of the Democratic Party. And we have to, if anybody wants to do anything, we all complain about the 94 crime bill. Well, look at the crime 10 years before that passed and then 10 years after it. And, maybe there are some things in there, and some of the sentencing stuff was admittedly harsh, but, if we'd have kept the assault weapons ban, I guarantee you that there'd have been a lot less people dead today. And the Democrats have to be very aggressive because, remember, we had declining crime rates in this country from the early 90s up until the last year of Trump's administration. It's always been Democrat-run cities, or as they call it, Democrat-run cities. And what changed was Trump and his lawlessness and his sort of green light for everybody else to be lawless. And I think the Democrats have to be aggressive on this issue.
Your thoughts?
Do those guys get paid to do that podcast?
Yeah, they have ads from Magic Spoon and all sorts of stuff.
What a scam. That's a nice hustle they got going there. I mean, it's just lightweight thinking. And also, they began with a discussion of policing, maybe ostensibly, but immediately went into crime statistics. And what really is the issue here is not crime, it's policing and the nature of policing and how policing is being conducted. So without a rigorous critique of how policing is conducted in tax-paying communities in the inner city, it's an incomplete conversation. And I would, I'm going to risk submitting that neither man is remotely qualified to comment on those conditions, and probably has never been or hasn't recently been in an inner city African-American community. And part of the one of the critiques inherent in defunding the police is not to, doesn't involve stripping the police of all budgetary resources whatsoever. It's about reallocating resources that are currently given to policing that might be put in things like social work, for example, and other ways to better serve the community. Because what we have now, we have police in schools, we have police going on calls that, you know, mental health workers need to be going on instead. And in order to make those things possible, resources have to be reallocated. And, you know, defund the police becomes this convenient phrase for encapsulating all of the changes that need to take place. And, you know, crime is really important, right? But crime is but one aspect of law and order. And I think that the conversation has to acknowledge that from the beginning. It has to take a comprehensive view before veering off in whatever direction they went in there, in order to mollify their sponsors and earn their paychecks.
Yeah, I mean, that's what scares me about the conversation as it's starting to happen within the Democratic Party, is that those ideas that you suggested are totally reasonable. Like, hey, let's not send police out on mental health calls. Let's start figuring out other ways to do this policing. I feel like that energy for that is starting to get dissipated. Now, I don't know, Sugi, what's happening in Minneapolis. I mean, that's sort of, you know, where they actually were going to enact some reforms. What's happening there?
It is stalled. I mean, as we're talking, I'm thinking about, you know, in Minneapolis this week, Darnella Frazier, who recorded the video of Derek Chauvin's murder of George Floyd, that brave kid, right? Her uncle was killed this week in a high-speed chase. That was where he was, as far as I understand, an innocent bystander, just like driving nearby, and the police were involved in this high-speed pursuit. And then after this accident, you know, they terminated pursuit. But, like, you know, where is the investigation into that? And I say this, Whitney, you probably remember, there was a high-speed chase in front of my house that totaled a car that involved the cops, that like ended in like a mini manhunt in my neighborhood. I have no idea what happened. Like, I saw cops laughing at the destruction that their chase had caused. I would also like an investigation of that. I just like, why are civilians collateral damage? Yeah. And that's acceptable. And for so long, it has been our Black neighbors and our Black neighborhoods that have been acceptable collateral damage. And the police are running amok. I mean, I told people about the high-speed chase in my neighborhood, and this was, by the way, a car that had already been hit actually by an unlicensed drunk driver. And then it was on the street, and then it got hit again by these carjackers who were being pursued by the police. And people were like, you are making this up. Please workshop this and take a little plot out. Like, you have gone too far. And it's just like, it's everywhere. And I feel like still, you know, we have this kind of, the mayor of Minneapolis, I think everyone I know wants him out because his response to this is insufficient. He has not called for the reform that he should. And it is, and it is the
There's
dog
your doggy.
There's my dog. I tried.
The dog has a view as well.
The dog is opposed to this. I mean, she was like, the police are doing what in front of our house? My rant has gone on long enough.
No, I agree with you. And I mean, I think that's where the conversation needs to be centered. What is happening inside of communities that the police are charged with protecting?
So last time we had you read a poem in which a childhood experience of yours appeared, and as part of a demonstration, you'd been handcuffed by Officer Friendly, visiting the childhood classroom, and that image of the cuffs became part of your writing. It was a demonstration of policing. And I wonder how you're thinking about your experiences of the past year, how those experiences are making their way into your work, and how the questions that drive your work have changed, if they have.
Well, it's interesting because I've been shut in. I haven't been to my office on campus since March 2020. So I haven't been on campus at all. So, you know, being very much inside, I think the work has turned somewhat interior, right? Because I'm not engaging with the larger world as much directly. And I think that in terms of, say, the pandemic, for example, it has, I think I've mentioned it in a couple of essays that I'm working on for a book of essays, but I didn't linger on it. And it was almost tangential to the subject matter of the essays. And except for those two pieces, it really has gone without mention in my work over the last year. And I think part of it is because for me, it's too soon. I have a lot to absorb and digest. And I'm sure at some point, it's going to begin to make its way into the work. And, on a certain level, I'm surprised that it hasn't done so much, because I've been kind of following other people and talking to other writers. And I'm kind of amazed that people can jump right on this stuff. And then, you immediately begin to see it manifest. And in this instance, that has not been me. So I think it will happen, but I think it's still germinating before I can really get to it.
We hear you have a novel coming out in January. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about it and give us a sneak preview for a special, sort of 100th episode,
Yeah,
look forward.
let's see. I'll give you a few paragraphs of it and you can edit it as you see fit. It is set in 1852. It's called Yonder. It'll be published in January by Simon & Schuster. It's available for pre-order now. And I guess the fundamental question that animates the novel is, what if you met someone and it became clear to both of you that you belonged together, that this was for lack of a better phrase, your soulmate. This is the person you really want to be with, and you have no control over that. There are other people who have control over that and get to determine who you can be with. And that's sort of the question of the novel. People placed in that dilemma and responding to it in various ways. So let's see. Okay, I'll read you a few paragraphs. Like I say, you can cut this. Rain had been falling for hours. Perhaps fall is too gentle a word. It was the kind of downpour that leaves scars, grooves, and dents in the earth. I shivered in my chains, blinking rapidly as it came down in sheets and pellets. With silent Mary's broth coursing through my innards, I had regained sufficient strength to hold myself in a sitting position, resting my head against the post. I had only to be alive until daybreak, and green would allow me just enough freedom to resume my life of bondage. Soaked to the bone, I awaited the dawn while considering the looming paradox of my situation, what little I had to live for. In the distance, the splintered gray boards of our cabins appeared to tremble and dissolve in the wet. The resulting cloud of grayness, murky and unsettled, gradually took on new shapes, outlines of boys and girls. Struck dumb, I watched while they marched down the corridor of the quarters toward me before veering sharply and proceeding toward the plantation borders. Clad in garments I had never seen, nothing like our sackcloth and threadbare cast-offs, they passed me in shades of gray, nearly close enough to touch. I had thought of my ancestors as ancient, with a history of torment etched on their weathered faces. But these were children, ranging in age from 5 harvests to 15, with gleaming faces and vigorous frames. I didn't understand their youthfulness. I understood only that they had been in the world before I came to it, and that they now belonged to some other place. Occasionally, a boy or girl would pause and look at me, then rejoin the procession without missing a step. They walked unsullied through the mud, as smoothly as if they were gliding on cushions of air. I called to them, but any sound I made was lost in the fury of the gale. That's it.
Thank you so much. What a treat to get a preview of that. So we will remind our listeners to pick up Jabari's work, poetry, nonfiction, writing for children, and as you just heard, fiction, available for pre-order now. His most recent book of poetry is Stop and Frisk, and Yonder, which you just heard a snippet of, is coming this January. Jabari, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here.
My pleasure.